Documentary script. In West Africa right now, a military leader just used the exact same diplomatic playbook that made him famous. Except this time, he's not the one being challenged. He's the one delivering the ultimatum. And the fallout is reshaping how nations negotiate power on an entire continent. This is the story of how Chad forced Burkina Faso's hand in just 48 hours, and why this moment matters far beyond two nations. To understand what just happened, you need to first understand Ibrahim Traoré. He's the president of Burkina Faso, and he didn't get there through traditional elections. In 2022, he led a military coup that overthrew the previous government, and in 2023, he did it again, removing another military leader who had taken power in a coup. Traoré presented himself as a nationalist, a strong man willing to reclaim Burkina Faso's sovereignty from foreign influence, particularly from France, which has historically maintained significant political and military control across West Africa. His rhetoric resonated. His bold diplomatic moves, expelling French forces, positioning himself as the voice of anti-colonial resistance, aligning with Russia, made him a household name not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa. For years, Traoré controlled the narrative. He set the terms. He made the demands. He was the one delivering ultimatums to international actors, lecturing France about respect and sovereignty. Every move he made was calculated for maximum impact, designed to consolidate power at home and project strength across the region. But that's not the full story. While Traoré was cementing his image as a nationalist firebrand, Chad's political situation was in its own state of upheaval. Chad, Burkina Faso's northwestern neighbor, has experienced decades of instability, military coups, civil conflicts, and constant power struggles. For much of recent history, Chad seemed like the weaker player in the region, the nation you'd expect to be on the receiving end of ultimatums, not delivering them. But in 2024, something changed. Mahamat Idris Deby took control of Chad, consolidating power in ways that reminded regional observers of a familiar pattern. A military leader using nationalist rhetoric and strategic alliances to consolidate power and expand influence. Sound familiar? Here's where things get interesting. Traoré's government had been consolidating its own influence across West Africa, particularly in the Sahel region, the semi-arid band of land stretching across the continent's midsection, where extremist groups, warlords, and regional powers clash constantly. Burkina Faso, under Traoré, was positioning itself not just as a military power, but as a regional authority, a nation dictating terms to its neighbors through military strength and diplomatic boldness. The problem? Chad was watching, and Chad had its own ambitions. Then came the announcement that shocked the continent. Chad delivered a 48-hour ultimatum to Burkina Faso's military leadership. Not a diplomatic note, not a formal request, an ultimatum, 48 hours to comply with critical regional and security matters. The specifics of those demands were initially shrouded in the kind of opacity that typically surrounds high-stakes military negotiations, but the message was crystal clear. Chad was no longer content to play second fiddle. Chad was asserting itself. Chad was demanding compliance. The irony is almost too perfect. Traoré had built his entire political brand on delivering ultimatums to international actors, telling France to leave, telling former allies to step aside, telling the world that Burkina Faso would no longer be bullied or ignored. And now, another military leader from a neighboring nation was doing the exact same thing to him, using his own playbook against him. The diplomatic style that made Traoré famous, bold, direct, uncompromising, was now being wielded by someone else. The announcement sent shockwaves across West Africa, and not the kind that fade quickly. This was the kind of geopolitical announcement that triggered immediate analysis, urgent debates, and strategic recalculation across the entire region. In political circles, diplomats and analysts scrambled to understand the implications. What were these critical regional and security matters? Was this about territorial disputes, border security, control over the Sahel, influence over extremist groups operating in both nations? The vagueness of the demands was itself a power move. It suggested Chad knew exactly what it wanted and expected Burkina Faso to figure it out quickly. Media outlets across West Africa, Africa more broadly, and international news organizations pivoted to cover the story. This wasn't just another regional spat. This was a potential flashpoint. This was a moment where the balance of power could shift. Social media erupted with analysis, speculation, and debate. Citizens in both nations, soldiers on high alert, military planners in neighboring countries. Everyone was watching the clock. 48 hours. That was the deadline. That was the pressure point. What made this ultimatum truly significant wasn't just the demand itself. It was the timing and the message it sent about the regional power structure. The Sahel has become increasingly important geopolitically over the past decade. Terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have established strongholds there. Russia has expanded its military influence, offering alternatives to Western security partnerships. China has invested heavily in infrastructure and resources. The United States continues to maintain military bases. And traditional African powers, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, are all looking at how instability in the Sahel affects their own interests. In this environment, military strength, diplomatic boldness, and the willingness to assert dominance matter enormously. Traoré had positioned Burkina Faso as a rising power, a nation unafraid to defy global superpowers. But Chad's ultimatum was a reality check. It was a reminder that power in West Africa isn't a static commodity to be hoarded. It's constantly negotiated, constantly contested, constantly shifting based on military strength, diplomatic maneuvering, and the willingness of leaders to take risks. But that's not the full picture either. What happens in Chad and Burkina Faso doesn't stay contained within those borders. The Sahel is interconnected. Mali, another nation that experienced military coups and is now ruled by a military junta, is watching. Niger, which also experienced military upheaval, is watching. Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and the entire West African community are watching. The Economic Community of West African States, known as ECOWAS, is watching. Because if Chad successfully pressures Burkina Faso into compliance through an ultimatum, it changes the playbook for how nations in the region interact. The ultimatum also highlighted something deeper: the fragile balance of power in West Africa. For years, there's been an assumption that stability comes from shared commitment to democratic institutions, international law, and multilateral organizations like ECOWAS. But the reality on the ground is far messier. Military coup follows military coup. Democratic constitutions are suspended and rewritten. International agreements are honored selectively. And when all else fails, nations resort to military posturing and direct demands. Traoré's government had been able to weather international criticism and isolation because his nationalist rhetoric played well domestically. Burkina Faso was dealing with a devastating insurgency from extremist groups, and many citizens believed that a strong military leader was necessary to combat the threat. France's military presence, which Traoré expelled, was controversial and seen by many as evidence of neo-colonial exploitation. Russia's presence, which Traoré welcomed, seemed like a genuine alternative. So even as the international community condemned the coups and questioned the legitimacy of Traoré's government, he maintained significant domestic support. But a military ultimatum from a neighboring nation was different. This wasn't a foreign power criticizing from a distance. This was a direct challenge to Traoré's authority from someone who understood the regional power structure intimately. This was a leader using the same nationalist and militarist rhetoric, but pointing it at Burkina Faso. And that created a unique pressure, because Traoré couldn't simply dismiss it as neo-colonial interference. This was African power politics, pure and simple. The 48-hour countdown created a pressure cooker. Within hours of the ultimatum, analysts were running scenarios. What would Traoré do? Would he capitulate, potentially signaling weakness at a critical moment when he'd built his entire political brand on strength and defiance? Would he refuse, risking military confrontation with a neighbor that had proven willing to escalate? Would there be a negotiated settlement, some behind-the-scenes deal that saved face for both parties? Every option came with consequences. Capitulation could undermine Traoré's authority domestically. He'd built his government on the promise that he would never bow to external pressure. Refusal could lead to military escalation, which neither nation could necessarily afford. Both were already dealing with insurgencies and resource constraints. And a negotiated settlement, while diplomatically appealing, would still send a message that Chad had power enough to pressure Burkina Faso into the negotiating room. Here's where things get even more complicated. The ultimatum revealed something about the regional power balance that many had underestimated: Chad's capacity for military assertiveness. Under Mahamat Idris Deby, Chad has been consolidating power both domestically and regionally. The nation has military assets, strategic location, and a leadership that's shown willingness to make bold moves. For years, observers focused on Burkina Faso as a rising power in the Sahel, the nation boldly positioning itself as a regional leader. But Chad's ultimatum suggested that this assessment might have been incomplete. Military planners across West Africa were recalculating. If Chad could deliver an ultimatum to Burkina Faso, a larger nation with a longer history of military rule and greater international profile, what did that mean for the balance of power more broadly? Could Chad become a regional hegemon? Was there a shift happening in real time, where one power was rising and another, while still formidable, was being pushed back? The social and political implications rippled outward quickly. Citizens in both nations felt the tension. In Burkina Faso, military personnel wondered if their leadership would stand firm or compromise. There was pride at stake, national dignity, the idea that their nation was being pushed around by a neighbor. In Chad, there was a sense of renewed confidence, a feeling that their leader was asserting the nation's rightful place in regional affairs. In neighboring nations, there was calculation about how to position themselves, which power to align with, how to adjust to what might be a shifting regional dynamic. The media coverage became increasingly intense. Every detail mattered. When would the 48 hours be up? What would the deadline produce? Would there be military mobilization? International mediation? Would ECOWAS intervene? Would any of the major powers, France, the United States, Russia, China, weigh in? Each of these scenarios carried different implications for the region and for the broader question of who held power and how that power would be used. What happened next would reveal not just the relationship between Chad and Burkina Faso, but the fundamental nature of power in West Africa. Would it be exercised through military dominance, diplomatic pressure, international alliances? Would smaller nations align with the rising power or stand together to balance against it? Would the international community get involved, or would this be resolved entirely through regional dynamics? The 48-hour ultimatum was more than a diplomatic or military showdown. It was a crystallizing moment that exposed the tensions underneath the surface of West African politics. It revealed the limits of nationalist rhetoric when confronted with hard military power. It showed that even a leader who'd successfully defied the international community could be pressured by a regional rival. And it suggested that the regional power structure was more fluid, more contested, more volatile than many had realized. The broader implications stretched across Africa. If Chad could successfully pressure Burkina Faso, what did that mean for the entire Sahel region? Would there be a scramble for dominance? Would other nations attempt similar ultimatums? Would the military governments that have proliferated across West Africa and the Sahel in recent years begin to see each other as rivals to be dominated rather than partners in a shared project of regional stability? The ultimatum also exposed the limitations of international institutions and the rules-based international order. ECOWAS had suspended Burkina Faso for military coups. International bodies had condemned the erosion of democratic norms. But when push came to shove, when one nation issued a direct ultimatum to another, what actual leverage did international organizations have? In a region where military strength, nationalist rhetoric, and the willingness to use force often trump diplomatic niceties, how much did international condemnation actually matter? This moment crystallized something that many analysts had been observing, but not fully articulating. The West African region, and the Sahel particularly, was entering a period of increased great power competition, military assertiveness, and contested authority. The rules that had governed regional relations, whether those rules came from ECOWAS, from international law, or from the legacy of colonialism, were being tested, bent, and sometimes broken. As the 48 hours counted down, the stakes became clearer. This wasn't just about Chad and Burkina Faso anymore. This was about what kind of region West Africa would become. Would it be dominated by a multipolar competition between several military powers, all seeking regional hegemony? Would there be dominant powers and subordinate powers, with ultimatums serving as the currency of dominance? Would international institutions matter, or would everything come down to military might and diplomatic leverage? The ultimatum represented the intersection of several critical trends: the proliferation of military governments in West Africa and the Sahel, the decline of French influence, and the rise of Russian and Chinese engagement, the ongoing contest over extremism and security in the Sahel, the reassertion of African agency in determining regional affairs without waiting for permission from traditional external powers, and the fundamental question of how power gets exercised and contested in the 21st century African context. For Traoré, the ultimatum was particularly humbling because it used his own playbook against him. He'd built his political identity on being bold, direct, uncompromising. He'd told France to leave. He'd dismissed international criticism. He'd presented himself as a leader unwilling to be bullied. And now he was being confronted with someone else embodying those exact qualities. The question was whether he could maintain his political narrative while responding to a direct challenge from a regional rival. For Devi and Chad, the ultimatum was an assertion of power and a signal to the region that Chad was no longer content to play a secondary role. Whether successful or not, the mere fact of issuing the ultimatum changed how Chad would be perceived regionally. It was a power move in the truest sense, not necessarily about the specific demands, but about establishing Chad's willingness to make direct demands of its neighbors. For the broader region, the ultimatum was a warning sign. It suggested that the stability that had seemed to emerge in some quarters was fragile and conditional. It indicated that regional rivalries were intensifying. It showed that military leaders, rather than moderating their behavior after taking power, were often emboldened to use that power more aggressively, both domestically and regionally. The ticking clock of that 48-hour deadline concentrated all of this into a single dramatic moment. Every hour that passed brought the moment of reckoning closer. Would Burkina Faso comply? Would it refuse and face the consequences? Would there be a negotiated exit? As the deadline approached, the answer would reveal not just the outcome of this particular dispute, but something much deeper about the nature of power, authority, and regional dynamics in West Africa at this critical historical moment. The ultimatum echoed across social media, in military barracks, in presidential offices, and in the minds of millions watching a contest between two regional powers that will shape the trajectory of the Sahel for years to come. And the world was watching too, because what happens in West Africa rarely stays contained. It influences migration patterns, security crises, extremism, and global geopolitics in ways that reverberate far beyond the region itself. This wasn't just a moment for West Africa. It was a moment that tested assumptions about power, sovereignty, and the future of military-ruled states in an increasingly multipolar world. And the answer to that test would come when the 48 hours expired, revealing not just the immediate outcome, but the future trajectory of an entire region in flux.